The cabin did not return to normal after that moment. It only pretended to for a few seconds longer, like everyone was waiting for someone else to decide what this was supposed to be. Nicole forced a tight smile, the kind that looked practiced but not natural, and straightened her uniform, as if posture alone could restore control. Sir, she said again, slower this time, more deliberate, I need you to comply with crew instructions now. Her voice carried farther than before, drawing in more eyes from across the aisle. A businessman in a navy suit paused mid-sip of his drink. A young couple leaned toward each other, whispering quietly, and near the galley, Emily Carter, the trainee, stood frozen, her hands hovering near her tablet, because she knew something was wrong, not just uncomfortable, but wrong in a way that did not match any training manual she had ever read. Darius did not look at Nicole immediately. Instead, his gaze moved across the cabin, not rushed, not nervous, just observant, like he was mapping the room piece by piece. He noticed the man 2 rows back who had stopped scrolling on his phone. He noticed the older woman by the window tightening her grip on her purse. And he noticed Emily watching from a distance, unsure but aware. And then finally, he looked back at Nicole, calm as ever. You are not enforcing policy, he said quietly. You are enforcing assumption. The words landed differently this time, not loud, but heavy. Nicole's jaw tightened. That is not your place to decide, she replied quickly, almost defensively. Your seat assignment is no longer valid and you are delaying departure. The captain has been notified and security will be involved if necessary. There, it was the escalation, step by step, predictable, almost scripted, and still Darius did not move, because he had heard that exact progression before, years ago in a hotel lobby in Houston. When he was 27 and dressed exactly like this, he had been told the same thing: not your place, not your space, not your level. And he remembered standing there back, then feeling the weight of proving himself pressing down on his chest, like something he owed the room, something he had to earn just to stay. And he remembered deciding in that moment that he would never ask for permission again, not from a clerk, not from a manager, not from anyone who measured worth by appearance. Instead, he built something larger, something quiet, but absolute. And now, years later, that same energy stood in front of him again, just wearing a different uniform. Nicole crossed her arms, shifting her weight, clearly expecting resistance or apology, something she could respond to, but Darius gave her neither. He simply rested his hands on the armrest, relaxed, steady, like time itself was on his side, because for him it was seconds were not pressure, they were preparation. Behind the curtain, things were already moving, unseen, unnoticed. A subtle exchange of glances from 2 passengers who had not spoken since boarding, a quiet adjustment of a jacket sleeve from a man seated near the aisle, movements so small they blended into the background unless you knew exactly what to look for. And Darius did. Nicole took a step closer, lowering her voice as if proximity would create authority. Listen, she said, you are making this harder than it needs to be. Just stand up, and we can resolve this without further issue. And that was the moment the line between control and desperation blurred, because resolution was never what she wanted. She wanted compliance, and Darius finally spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. No, he said simply, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. And somewhere beyond the cabin door, a quiet signal had already been received, the kind that does not echo but changes everything. The silence stretched just a second too long, and in that second the cabin chose a side, not loudly, not openly, but in the subtle shifts of posture and expression that reveal what people really think. Nicole felt it, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way eyes stayed fixed on her instead of drifting away, and it made her voice sharper when she spoke again, louder now, so the entire first-class cabin could hear. This passenger is refusing to follow crew instructions and is delaying departure. Her words carried weight, but not the kind she expected, because instead of authority, they carried doubt. A man across the aisle frowned slightly, like something did not add up. A woman near the window shook her head almost imperceptibly, and Emily in the galley took a step forward before stopping herself. Her training said stay back, but her instincts said speak. Darius remained seated, his posture unchanged, his presence somehow larger now. Without him moving at all. You can say it again, he said calmly. It will not make it true. Nicole's expression hardened. She turned halfway, addressing the cabin. As much as him, we deal with situations like this all the time, she said, attempting to regain narrative confidence. People board with incorrect seating or try to access areas they did not pay for. We are simply enforcing policy. The word policy landed, but it did not settle, because Darius tilted his head slightly, studying her not with anger, but with precision. And then he asked one question that cut through everything. Did you verify that? Or did you decide a few passengers shifted uncomfortably because they knew the answer? Even if no one said it out loud, Nicole hesitated just long enough for it to be noticed before responding sharply. Your name is not listed in this seat assignment system. That is the only verification required. And there it was, the line drawn in clear terms: system versus person. But what she did not know, what she could not see, was that systems could be changed from the inside far faster than they could be explained out loud. Behind her near the aisle, a man who had boarded early adjusted his watch, glancing once toward the cockpit door, then back toward Darius. A silent confirmation passed in that moment, unnoticed by everyone except the one person it was meant for. Darius leaned back slightly, his voice still measured. You are relying on a system you do not control. Nicole let out a short breath, almost a laugh. Now you are just making excuses, she said, and signaled toward the front of the cabin. I am calling the captain. This ends now. But as she reached for the intercom, something else happened first. Not dramatic, not loud, just a shift. The overhead lights flickered once so quickly it could have been dismissed as turbulence, and then steadied again. But the energy in the cabin changed instantly. Conversations stopped completely. This time, even the hum of the plane felt distant, like something else had taken priority. Emily noticed it first, her eyes moving from the lights to the panel in the galley where a small indicator blinked in a pattern she had never seen before. She frowned, stepping closer, as if proximity would explain it, but it did not. Nicole pressed the intercom button. Captain, we have a non-compliant passenger in first class requesting immediate assistance. Her voice sounded firm again, but underneath it there was a trace of something new, something she had not felt a minute ago: uncertainty. Because Darius did not react to her call. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. He simply watched, and then quietly, almost gently, he said, you might want to listen very carefully to what happens next. And for the first time since this started, Nicole did not have a response, because deep down something told her she was no longer the one in control. The intercom clicked, but the voice that came through was not what Nicole expected. It was not rushed, not confused, not even questioning. It was calm, controlled, and precise. Flight Attendant Harris, stand by for directive. The tone alone made her pause, because it was not the tone of someone responding to a problem. It was the tone of someone already aware of it. Her grip on the receiver tightened. This is first class. We have a non-compliant passenger, she repeated louder now, trying to reassert control, but the voice cut in before she could finish. We are aware. The response came without hesitation, without doubt, and that single sentence shifted something again, because awareness meant this was no longer her situation to define. Around the cabin, passengers leaned in, subtly, not speaking, but fully engaged. Now the quiet curiosity had turned into something sharper, something closer to realization. Emily stepped closer to the galley panel, her eyes fixed on the blinking indicator as it changed pattern again. Her training did not cover this. Nothing in her manual explained why internal signals would override standard cabin communication. She swallowed hard and looked toward Darius, then back to Nicole, as if trying to connect two things that should not be connected, but clearly were. Nicole lowered the intercom slightly, her voice dropping as she spoke again. Who exactly am I speaking to? There was a brief pause, not long enough to feel empty, but long enough to feel deliberate. Operations Control, came the reply, but even that sounded different, not like a department, but like a position of authority. Nicole glanced around the cabin, expecting backup, expecting someone to validate her stance, but instead she found eyes watching her, not supporting her, not opposing her, just watching. And that was worse, because it meant the room had stopped following her lead. Darius shifted slightly in his seat, not moving away, not preparing to leave, just adjusting, like someone settling in for what came next. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, almost conversational. You are starting to hear it now. Nicole's eyes snapped toward him. What are you talking about? She asked, but the edge in her voice had dulled just enough to reveal something underneath: uncertainty, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of it. Because this no longer felt like a simple disagreement. This felt structured, intentional, like pieces had been set in motion long before she raised her voice. The intercom came alive again. Flight Attendant Harris, you are instructed to cease escalation and maintain current passenger status until further notice. The wording was careful, controlled, and final. Nicole blinked, processing. Cease escalation, maintain status. That was not resolution, that was containment, and containment meant the situation was not what she thought it was. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, because for the first time she realized she did not know what to say that would not make things worse. Across the aisle, the businessman in the navy suit leaned back slowly, a faint smile forming, not of amusement, but of recognition, like he had just figured out something important. The older woman by the window relaxed her grip, slightly, her eyes now fixed on Darius instead of Nicole, and Emily took one more step forward, this time, not stopping, her voice quiet but clear-eyed. Saw his ticket scan earlier. She said it was valid. The words landed softly, but they carried weight because they broke the last illusion that this was about policy. Nicole turned sharply toward her. That is not your place to comment, she snapped, but the reaction came too fast, too defensive, and everyone felt it. Darius did not look at Emily. He did not need to. He simply nodded, once almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a move on a board only he could fully see. And then he spoke again, low, measured, final. You are not losing control because of me, he said. You are losing control because you chose the wrong assumption. And as the words settled, the cabin no longer felt like a place of authority. It felt like a place waiting for a verdict that had already been decided somewhere else. The air inside the cabin no longer felt neutral. It felt measured, like every second was being watched from somewhere beyond the walls. Nicole stood still for a moment longer than she intended, her hand still gripping the intercom, her authority now caught between what she believed and what she was starting to realize. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, studying her reaction like it mattered more than the situation itself, because now it did. Emily remained near the galley, her voice no longer uncertain, but grounded. I checked the scan twice, she said again, softer this time, but clearer. It went through as valid. Nicole exhaled sharply, turning away from her, as if dismissing the statement could erase it. We are not relying on trainee observation, she replied, but the edge was gone, replaced with something tighter, something forced, because the cabin had already heard it. And once something true enters the room, it does not leave. Darius sat unmoved, his posture relaxed, his presence unwavering. He did not rush the moment, he let it breathe, because pressure reveals more than confrontation ever could. He glanced briefly toward the aisle, where one of the passengers shifted his position just enough to signal awareness, not action, not yet, just readiness, the kind that does not announce itself but waits for the exact second it is needed. Nicole finally lowered the intercom completely, her next words no longer broadcast, but spoken directly to Darius, her voice controlled, but lower. Listen, whatever you think is happening, this is not how it works. You cannot just sit here and override procedure without consequence. Darius looked at her, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, certainty. I have not overridden anything, he said quietly. You did. Nicole frowned slightly, as if the statement did not make sense, but something about it stayed with her, because deep down she could feel it. The shift had not started with him, it had started the moment she made a decision. Without verification, the moment she chose assumption over fact, the moment she stopped seeing a passenger and started seeing a problem. And now that decision was unfolding in real time across the system. She did not control. The overhead light flickered again, softer this time, barely noticeable, but enough for Emily to glance back at the panel where the indicator had changed from blinking to steady. She stepped closer, reading the small text beneath it, something she had never seen before. Restricted channel. Active. Her breath caught slightly, because restricted channels were not triggered by standard crew interaction. They were triggered by something else, something higher, something deliberate. She looked toward the cockpit door, then back to Darius, her expression shifting from confusion to realization. Nicole noticed the movement. What is that, she asked sharply, but Emily hesitated for a split second before answering. I do not know, but it is not normal. And that word, not normal, settled heavily in the cabin because it confirmed what everyone was starting to feel. This was no longer routine. This was something else, something controlled from a level none of them had access to. Darius leaned forward, just slightly enough to meet Nicole's eyes again. You still think this is about a seat, he said, his voice calm, but final. It never was. Nicole opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, because at that exact moment a soft chime echoed through the cabin, not loud, not alarming, just precise, like a signal meant for a select few. And from the back of the cabin, one of the passengers stood, not abruptly, not aggressively, just with purpose, adjusting his jacket as he stepped into the aisle. And for the first time, Nicole realized she was not the only one who had been watching this entire time. The man who stood did not rush, he did not speak, he simply stepped into the aisle with a calm that did not match the tension around him. And that was the first sign that this was not random. His movement was precise, measured, like someone following instruction, not reacting to chaos. Nicole turned toward him immediately, her voice snapping back into authority. "Sir, please return to your seat. This situation does not involve you." But the man did not stop. He adjusted his jacket slightly, revealing nothing obvious, yet everything about his posture changed the space around him, as if an invisible line had been crossed. "I believe it does involve me," he said quietly, his tone controlled, respectful, but firm enough that it did not invite dismissal. The cabin reacted in silence, now not confusion, but focus, because something had shifted again. Another passenger, 2 rows ahead, glanced back, then slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, the sound soft but sharp in the stillness, and stood, as well, not hurried, not aggressive, just aligned, as if responding to the same signal. Emily's eyes widened as she watched the second man step into the aisle. Her training told her this was escalation, but her instincts told her this was coordination. Nicole felt it now, the difference between disruption and structure, and it unsettled her more than anything else, because disruption could be controlled, structure could not. "You both need to sit down immediately," she said, her voice louder now, but it no longer carried the same certainty because the room was no longer following her lead. Darius remained seated, watching, not interfering, not directing, at least not visibly, but his presence anchored everything like the center of a storm that had not yet revealed its full force. The first man stopped a few feet from Nicole, maintaining distance, maintaining composure, his hands visible, his stance open, not threatening, but not yielding either. "We are going to need you to step back," he said calmly, and that single sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have, because it implied authority without needing to declare it. Nicole blinked, processing. "We? Who is we?" she asked, but even as the question left her mouth, she already knew the answer. Because the second man had now moved closer, positioning himself near the aisle behind Darius, not blocking, not surrounding, just present, like a boundary that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Darius exhaled, slowly, not relief, not tension, just timing. And then he spoke again, his voice low, steady, final. "You kept asking for verification," he said. "Now you are getting it." Nicole's eyes shifted between the two men, then back to him, her confidence unraveling in small, precise cracks. "This is not protocol," she said, but the words sounded weaker now, because she no longer knew what protocol applied. The first man gave a slight nod, acknowledging something unseen, and then spoke again. "You are instructed to disengage from this passenger immediately and return to your assigned position." The wording was exact, controlled, unmistakably official, and for the first time Nicole hesitated, not because she wanted to, but because she did not know what would happen if she did not. Around them, the cabin held its breath, not in fear, but in anticipation, because everyone could feel it the moment before something irreversible happens. Darius leaned back slightly, his gaze steady on Nicole. "You thought you were enforcing rules," he said quietly, "but you were enforcing judgment, and judgment has consequences." The words settled into the silence, and from somewhere beyond the cabin another soft chime echoed, not louder, not sharper, just final, and this time no one mistook it for anything ordinary. The second chime did not fade. It lingered just long enough to be recognized as intentional, and then the cabin speakers activated, not with an announcement for passengers, but with a controlled internal tone that cut through the air like a signal only certain people understood. The two men in the aisle straightened, almost in sync, not reacting, but confirming, and that was when Nicole's composure finally slipped, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the smallest way that mattered. Her silence stretched too long. Her next step never came, and Darius saw it instantly. The exact moment realization began to replace assumption, he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, but carrying across the entire first-class cabin. "You asked for proof," he said. "Now listen carefully, because this is the part where everything you believe stops working." The words settled into the space like a line drawn in concrete, and for the first time no one interrupted him, not Nicole, not the passengers, not even the quiet hum of movement in the background, because something about his tone made it clear this was not a conversation anymore. This was a reveal. Nicole swallowed, trying to regain control over something that was already gone. "You still have not identified yourself," she said, but the question lacked force. It sounded procedural, not authoritative, and that difference mattered. Darius nodded once, as if acknowledging the final step in a sequence he had already completed, and then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, just undeniable. "My name is Darius Cole," he said, and for a fraction of a second nothing happened, because names alone do not carry weight until they connect to something larger. But then it did. The businessman across the aisle sat up straighter, recognition flashing across his face. The older woman near the window inhaled softly, as if she had just remembered where she had seen that name before, and even Emily in the galley felt it, the shift from unknown to undeniable, Because some names do not need explanation, they carry context with them. Darius continued, his voice steady. I am the chief executive officer of Altitude Group and a primary stakeholder in this airline. Every word landed with precision, not rushed, not emphasized, just placed exactly where it needed to be, and the effect was immediate. The room did not erupt, it did not react loudly, it froze. Because this was not information that invited debate, it was information that ended it. Nicole's expression changed completely. The certainty that had driven her actions moments ago dissolved into something else, something fragile and exposed. She took a small step back, not commanded, not forced, just instinctive, as if distance could undo what had already been set in motion. That is not possible, she said quietly, but even she did not believe it because everything around her had already aligned with his statement. The two men in the aisle did not move, they did not need to. Their presence now made sense. Their silence now had meaning. The signals, the chimes, the system overrides, every piece fell into place at once. Darius watched her calmly, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that comes when a moment reaches its inevitable conclusion. You thought this was about a seat, he said again. But now the words carried weight. You thought you were correcting a mistake, but you were creating one. Nicole opened her mouth again, searching for something, anything to regain footing, but there was nothing left to say because the system she trusted had already answered the question she refused to ask. And in that silence, the entire cabin understood what she had not from the beginning. This was never about where he was sitting, it was about who he was and who she decided he could not be. No one spoke after the name settled into the cabin. It did not need confirmation, it did not need repetition, it simply existed, and everything around it adjusted accordingly. Nicole stood frozen, her posture no longer commanding but uncertain, her hands no longer steady, but searching for something to hold on to, a version of control that had already slipped beyond reach. The two men in the aisle remained exactly where they were, not moving, not advancing, just present, like a line that could not be crossed again. The businessman across the aisle slowly exhaled, as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, and the older woman near the window lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back at Darius with something new in her eyes, not curiosity, not doubt, but respect, quiet, immediate, and undeniable. Emily stepped back from the panel, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to carry throughout the stillness. It just updated, she said. The system, her eyes flicked toward Nicole, then back to the display. It now shows executive clearance priority, override active. The words echoed differently, this time not as information, but as confirmation, because they aligned perfectly with what had just been revealed. Nicole shook her head slightly, as if trying to push the reality away that cannot be changed mid-flight. She said, but the statement lacked conviction, because everything in front of her had already changed. Without her permission, without her awareness. Darius did not respond immediately. He let the moment settle fully, because truth does not need to be rushed, it only needs to be seen, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. He glanced briefly toward the two men, and gave the smallest nod, not a command, not a signal, just acknowledgement, and they responded in kind, shifting their stance subtly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply reinforcing the boundary that now defined the space. Nicole looked around again, searching for support, for validation, for anything that would restore the structure she relied on, but the cabin had already moved on, not physically, but mentally. The passengers were no longer watching a conflict, they were witnessing a consequence. And that distinction changed everything. Her voice came again, softer now, almost careful. If this is true, she began, but the sentence did not finish because she did not know how to complete it. Without admitting what had already happened, Darius leaned forward slightly, his tone calm, but firm. It is not about what is true now, he said, it is about what you chose before you knew, and that is what defines this moment. The words landed with precision, because they were not an accusation, they were a conclusion. Nicole's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension shifting from resistance to realization, and in that shift, the entire dynamic of the cabin transformed, no longer a space of challenge, but a space of resolution. The intercom clicked again, and this time the voice that came through carried a different tone, not controlled, not neutral, but directive. Flight attendant Harris, you are to step away from the passenger immediately and await further instruction from operations. The phrasing was final, unmistakable, and it left no room for interpretation. Nicole did not respond right away. She did not argue. She did not question. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of what had unfolded around her, and for the first time since this began, she looked at Darius not as a problem, not as a passenger, but as exactly who he was, and in that recognition, everything she had said, everything she had assumed, everything she had enforced shifted into something irreversible, the kind of mistake that does not disappear once it is understood, it only waits to be answered. The command hung in the air, and this time it did not wait for interpretation, it demanded response. Nicole stood there for one final second, caught between who she had been 5 minutes ago and who she was now expected to be, and then slowly, almost mechanically, she stepped back, not because she chose to, but because there was no version of this moment where she could remain, where she was. The distance between her and Darius was small in feet, but enormous in meaning, because everything that once gave her authority had been stripped away, not loudly, not publicly, but completely. The two men in the aisle did not move. They did not need to. Their presence alone confirmed that control had already shifted beyond the visible cabin. Emily watched closely, her expression no longer uncertain, but steady as she absorbed every detail, because this was no longer a lesson in procedure, this was a lesson in consequence. The businessman across the aisle nodded once to himself, as if closing a thought he had been forming since the beginning, and the older woman near the window sat back fully, now her posture relaxed, as if the tension that once filled the space had finally found its resolution. Darius remained seated exactly where he had been from the start, unchanged, unmoved, because he had never needed to move. The system had moved for him. He glanced briefly toward the window, then back toward Nicole, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to prove itself. Nicole's voice came again, but this time it was different, not sharp, not defensive, just quiet. I did not know, she said, and for a moment the entire cabin listened, not to her words, but to what they represented, the realization that came too late. Darius nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but not accepting it as an answer. You were not supposed to know, he said calmly. You were supposed to ask. The words landed softly, but they carried more weight than anything else spoken that day, because they did not accuse, they revealed. Nicole lowered her gaze slightly, the truth settling in not as a sudden impact, but as a slow, undeniable understanding that every step she had taken had led here, not because of who he was, but because of what she chose to believe. Before she knew, the intercom activated once more, this time with finality. Flight Attendant Harris, you are to report to the forward station immediately upon landing. Further review will be conducted. No emotion, no emphasis, just procedure, and that made it even more absolute. Nicole did not respond. She did not argue. She simply nodded once and stepped away fully, now leaving the space she had tried to control behind her, as if it no longer belonged to her, because it never had. The cabin exhaled collectively, not in celebration, but in closure, because what had just happened was not a victory, it was a correction. Darius leaned back once more, his voice the last to settle into the silence. I did not raise my voice, he said quietly. I raised the standard, and with that the moment ended, not with noise, not with applause, but with something far more powerful, understanding that the difference between authority and assumption is not loud, it is final.